A Federal Reserve official just told you exactly how long your borrowing costs are going to stay elevated. And if you were hoping for rate cuts, if you were counting on mortgage relief, if you were planning your financial life around the expectation that interest rates would come down anytime soon, you need to hear exactly what she said, because the words were not vague. The words were not hedged. The words were as direct as central bankers ever get, and they translate into real money out of your wallet for months or years to come. Beth Hammack, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, told the New York Times that interest rates are expected to remain unchanged for quite some time. Quite some time. Those three words carry more weight than any policy statement, any press conference, any economic projection. When a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee tells the newspaper of record that rates stay elevated for quite some time, she is telling you something that markets immediately price in and that you need to understand before it costs you money. What does quite some time mean? It means not March. It means not April. It means probably not June. It means the rate cuts that were supposed to provide relief are being pushed further and further into the future until they disappear over the horizon entirely. And the data confirms exactly what Hammack is saying. The CME FedWatch tool, which calculates probabilities of Fed rate decisions based on futures market pricing, shows a 97% probability that the Federal Reserve will hold rates steady at its next meeting on March 17th and 18. 97%. That is not uncertainty. That is not a maybe. That is as close to certainty as financial markets ever get. The Fed is not cutting rates in March. Period. The current federal funds rate sits at a range of 3.5 to 3.75%. That is where it will stay after March. That is where it stayed after January, when the Fed held rates steady for the first time after 3 consecutive cuts at the end of 2025. The cutting cycle that began with such promise has ground to a halt, and Hammack is telling you it will stay halted for quite some time. Let me show you why this is happening, because the dynamics inside the Federal Reserve reveal a central bank that has lost consensus, lost direction, and cannot agree on the most fundamental question of monetary policy. Should rates go up, down, or stay the same? The Federal Open Market Committee, the 12-person body that sets interest rate policy, is split into factions that are pulling in opposite directions. And the fracture is so severe that official meeting minutes now acknowledge the disagreement explicitly. One faction sees a greater risk of inflation reigniting and favors keeping rates higher for longer to ensure inflation falls back to the Fed's 2% annual target. This is the hawkish contingent. They believe the 3 rate cuts delivered in late 2025 were sufficient, possibly even too aggressive. They want to hold rates where they are and watch whether inflation continues falling or stabilizes above target. But it goes further than holding steady. Several Fed members wanted to signal that a rate increase is in the cards if inflation runs hotter than expected. According to minutes from the most recent Fed meeting, several participants indicated that they would have supported a two-sided description of the committee's future interest rate decisions, reflecting the possibility that upward adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate could be appropriate if inflation remains above the target. Read that carefully. Several participants, not one outlier. Several voting members of the FOMC wanted the official statement to include language about possible rate hikes. The January statement did not include that language because other members opposed it. But the hawks are there. They are vocal, and they are pushing for the Fed to signal that the next move could be up, not down. On the opposite end of the debate, at least one Fed official is pushing for the steep rate cuts that President Trump has demanded. Stephen Moran has called for 4 rate cuts this year, which would lower the rate by a full percentage point, and he wants them sooner rather than later. Moran's argument is that inflation is likely to fall and the Fed should be proactive about supporting the economy. Although inflation is still above the Fed's 2% annual target, Moran said it was likely to fall. He is betting on a scenario where inflation moderates without further Fed action, and the elevated rates then become unnecessarily restrictive. Other Fed officials have said rate cuts will be needed to boost the faltering job market. This is the dovish contingent, citing the other half of the Fed's dual mandate. They see employment risks as more pressing than inflation risks and want policy to shift toward supporting hiring and economic activity. So you have hawks who want rate hikes, doves who want 4 rate cuts, and a middle contingent that wants to hold steady for quite some time. That is not consensus, that is paralysis. And paralysis means the status quo persists. Rates stay where they are, your mortgage stays expensive, your credit card stays expensive. The relief that was supposed to come never arrives because the committee cannot agree on which direction to move. Now, let me show you what Hammack specifically said about the economic conditions driving this paralysis, because her assessment reveals how the Fed is thinking about the months ahead. Hammack told the New York Times that it is important to make sure that we are maintaining policy at a level where we can drive inflation back down to target while balancing any potential softness in the labor market. That single sentence captures the tension at the heart of Fed policy. Inflation is too high, the labor market might weaken, both require attention. But the tools to address them pull in opposite directions. If the Fed focuses on inflation and keeps rates high or raises them, the labor market suffers. High borrowing costs reduce business investment. Companies hire less. Unemployment rises. The Fed achieves its inflation goal but fails its employment mandate. If the Fed focuses on the labor market and cuts rates aggressively, inflation rises. Cheaper borrowing stimulates demand. Spending increases. Prices climb. The Fed supports employment but fails its inflation mandate. The current strategy is to hold steady and hope both problems resolve without aggressive intervention. But Hammack acknowledged the uncertainty about whether that hope is justified. If we see more weakness emerging in the labor market, it could mean that we need to provide more accommodation. Accommodation is Fed speak for rate cuts. If jobs weaken, cuts become appropriate. But that is not what the current data shows. The labor market is relatively steady. Unemployment is stable at 4.3%. There is no collapse in hiring that would justify emergency rate cuts. If we do not see inflation moving toward target, as I expect, it could mean that we need to put more restriction on the economy. Restriction is Fed speak for rate hikes. If inflation stays elevated, hikes become appropriate. And inflation is staying elevated. Core PCE is running at 3%, a full point above the 2% target. The inflation problem is not solved. Hammack said she expected inflation to ease gradually over the summer, but remain above target beyond the end of the year. Above target beyond the end of the year. That means throughout 2026, inflation stays above where the Fed wants it. That means throughout 2026, the Fed has reason to keep rates elevated. That means throughout 2026, you pay higher borrowing costs because the inflation that was supposed to be defeated keeps stubbornly persisting. Now let me show you the Iran war dimension because this is the wild card that could push the Fed's decision in either direction. Hammack said it was too early to gauge the economic impact of the Iran war, too early to gauge. The conflict began Saturday, markets opened Monday, and a voting Fed official is telling you that the central bank does not yet know how to incorporate the war into its economic forecasts. Federal Reserve officials on Tuesday began taking stock of the widening conflict in the Middle East that could pose near-term risks to both U.S. inflation and growth, despite the economy's relative resilience to energy price shocks. The war creates competing pressures. Higher oil prices are inflationary. They push costs up across the economy. They feed into consumer prices. They give hawks ammunition to argue for keeping rates high or raising them. Inflation risks from oil would argue against rate cuts. But the war could also damage growth. Higher energy costs reduce consumer spending power. Business costs rise. Economic activity slows. A war-induced recession would give doves ammunition to argue for rate cuts. Growth risks from war would argue for rate cuts. The Fed does not know yet which effect will dominate. The conflict is days old. The duration is unknown. The severity of supply disruption is unknown. The scope of Iranian retaliation is unknown. Every variable that would inform the Fed's decision is still uncertain. This uncertainty reinforces the hold steady approach. When you do not know whether the next shock will be inflationary or recessionary, you wait. You do not cut rates into an inflation spike. You do not hold rates into a recession. You wait until the picture clarifies. But waiting means rates stay elevated. Waiting means no relief. Waiting means your mortgage rate, your credit card rate, your car loan rate, all of it stays high, while the Fed watches developments and assesses impacts and deliberates at meetings and issues statements that say essentially nothing has changed. Now let me show you the drama behind the scenes because the Fed faces challenges beyond monetary policy that threaten its leadership and independence. Time is ticking for the Senate to hold confirmation hearings for Kevin Warsh, President Trump's nominee to serve as chair of the Federal Reserve. If approved by Congress, Warsh would take the reins at the central bank when Jerome Powell's term as chair ends in May. May is 2 months away. Confirmation hearings typically take weeks. Committee deliberations take additional time. Senate floor votes require scheduling. The timeline is tight, and complications are emerging that could delay or derail the process entirely. Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina and member of the powerful Senate Banking Committee, has said he would hold up Warsh's confirmation unless the administration drops an investigation into renovations at the Federal Reserve's building. The probe is aimed at Powell's statements to the Senate last year about alleged cost overruns in a years-long project to renovate the Fed's headquarters in Washington. Let me make sure you understand what is happening here. A Republican senator is threatening to block the Republican president's nominee to lead the Federal Reserve because of a dispute about construction costs at the Fed's office building. The Justice Department has reportedly issued subpoenas. The Fed has reportedly resisted them. And the entire leadership transition at the most powerful central bank in the world is being held hostage to a bureaucratic dispute about building renovation. This is not how monetary policy is supposed to work. This is not how central bank transitions are supposed to happen. This is dysfunction that threatens to leave the Fed without confirmed leadership at a moment when the Iran war requires steady hands and clear policy direction. Powell has not said if he will continue as a rank-and-file member of the Fed's Board of Governors after his chairmanship ends. He has been asked about that issue at past press conferences and declined to answer. If Powell leaves entirely when his chairmanship ends, and if Warsh is not confirmed in time, you could have a Federal Reserve without permanent leadership during one of the most consequential geopolitical and economic moments in years. The Fed has mechanisms for acting without a confirmed chair. The vice chair can assume certain duties. Decisions can still be made. But the optics of a leaderless Fed during a war-driven inflation shock would further damage the institution's credibility and independence. And the political fights over investigations and confirmation hearings inject partisan dynamics into an institution that is supposed to be above politics. Now let me show you what the March meeting will look like, because even though rates are 97% certain to stay unchanged, the meeting will send signals about the path forward. The Federal Open Market Committee will meet March 17th and 18. 12 voting members will assess economic conditions and make monetary policy decisions. They will consider cutting the federal funds rate from its current range of 3.5 to 3.75%, and they will almost certainly decide not to cut. The statement that emerges from the meeting will be parsed for every word. Does it mention the possibility of rate hikes that the hawks wanted to signal? Does it emphasize labor market concerns that the doves are raising? Does it acknowledge the Iran war and its uncertain impact? Does it change the forward guidance about the path of policy? Chairman Powell will hold a press conference after the meeting. Reporters will ask about the war. They will ask about inflation. They will ask about the split inside the committee. They will ask about his plans after his term ends. Powell will give carefully hedged answers that reveal as little as possible while still seeming responsive. That is how Fed press conferences work. But the overall message will be clear. Rates stay where they are. The Fed is in wait-and-see mode. Progress on inflation has stalled. The labor market is stable. The war adds uncertainty that the Fed cannot yet quantify, and quite some time means what it says: months of elevated rates before any change becomes likely. Fed officials have mostly entered wait-and-see mode to assess how the economy reacts to its recent moves before cutting rates again. The 3 rate cuts at the end of 2025 were meant to prevent the job market slowdown from turning into a serious increase in unemployment. The Fed judged those cuts were enough. Now they are waiting to see if they were right. If the economy holds up with rates at current levels, no more cuts are needed. The November through January cutting cycle was sufficient. Rates stay at 3.5 to 3.75% indefinitely. If the economy weakens significantly, more cuts become appropriate. The labor market softening that has not yet materialized would justify additional easing. But nothing in current data suggests that weakness is imminent. If inflation rises rather than falls, rate hikes become necessary. The 3% core PCE that is already too high could climb toward 3.5 or 4% if the oil shock from Iran persists. At that point, holding steady would be insufficient. The Fed would need to tighten to regain credibility. The March meeting will not resolve these uncertainties. It will simply document them. The statement will acknowledge that conditions are evolving. The press conference will reiterate data dependence, and rates will stay exactly where they are while you continue paying elevated borrowing costs. Now let me show you the practical implications, because the abstract policy debate becomes very concrete when it affects your household finances. If you have a mortgage at a variable rate, or if you are planning to buy a home, the Fed holding rates for quite some time means mortgage rates stay elevated for quite some time. The 30-year fixed rate around 6.5% is not coming down to 5% anytime soon. The home that was already unaffordable at 6.5% remains unaffordable. The monthly payment that was already stretching your budget continues stretching your budget. On a $400,000 mortgage, the difference between a 6.5% rate and a 5.5% rate is approximately $250 per month. That is $3,000 per year. Over 30 years, that is $90,000. Every month the Fed waits is a month you pay the higher rate. Every month of quite some time is money out of your pocket. If you carry credit card debt, the average rate remains above 20%. Credit card rates are tied to the prime rate, which follows the Fed funds rate. If the Fed holds rates steady for quite some time, your credit card rate stays above 20% for quite some time. The minimum payments that barely cover interest continue barely covering interest. The principal that never seems to decline continues not declining. If you have an auto loan or are planning to buy a car, rates in the 7 to 8% range remain in place. The transportation you need to get to work costs more to finance. The car payment that consumes a growing share of household income continues consuming that share. If you run a business that needs to borrow for equipment, inventory, or expansion, your borrowing costs stay elevated. The projects that would have been profitable at lower rates remain marginal at current rates. The hiring you might have done gets delayed. The investment you might have made gets postponed. The Fed's hold policy has real costs that compound over time. Every month of quite some time adds to the cumulative burden on households and businesses. The rate relief that was supposed to arrive in 2026 may not arrive at all if inflation stays elevated and the war adds uncertainty. Now let me show you the uncertainty about Warsh, because his confirmation and policy approach add another layer of unpredictability. Kevin Warsh was a Fed governor during the 2008 financial crisis. He has been a critic of large-scale asset purchases, arguing that quantitative easing inflated asset prices and widened inequality. If confirmed as chair, he would bring different priorities than Powell. Trump nominated Warsh specifically because Warsh indicated he would lower rates. Trump has demanded rates as low as 1%. He publicly stated he would not have nominated someone who wanted to raise rates. Warsh's selection was supposed to guarantee rate cuts, but the confirmation is not guaranteed. Senator Tillis's threat creates uncertainty. The building investigation creates controversy. The timeline creates pressure. Even if Warsh is eventually confirmed, the process might not be complete before Powell's term ends in May, and Warsh's policy intentions remain ambiguous. He has historically been more hawkish than his nomination suggests. He criticized QE, he warned about inflation, he advocated for tighter policy. Michael Feroli at J.P. Morgan suggested that Warsh might initially argue for rate cuts, but that his leanings will be more open to revision and perhaps reversion back to a more hawkish view, particularly after the midterm elections. This creates a scenario where you might get rate cuts initially under a Warsh Fed, followed by rate hikes when the political pressure subsides. The whipsaw of cutting then tightening would be more disruptive than simply holding steady throughout. The leadership uncertainty at the Fed compounds the policy uncertainty. You do not know who will be setting rates by summer. You do not know what that person's priorities will be. You do not know how the Iran war will affect their calculations. You do not know whether inflation rises or falls. You do not know whether the labor market holds or weakens. In that environment of comprehensive uncertainty, the safest bet for the Fed is to do nothing. Hold rates steady. Wait for clarity. Let the data and the situation evolve, and your borrowing costs stay elevated while the waiting continues. Now let me show you the inflation dynamic, because this is what keeps the Fed from cutting, even though parts of the economy might benefit from lower rates. With inflation too high and the labor market relatively steady, the central bank should keep its focus trained on stamping out price pressures. That is Hammack's assessment. Stamping out price pressures, not pivoting to support growth, not cutting rates to help the housing market. Stamping out inflation remains the priority. Core PCE inflation is running at approximately 3%. The Fed's target is 2%. They are a full percentage point above target, and progress toward target has stalled. The inflation that was supposed to fall smoothly back to 2% has instead plateaued around 3%. The oil shock from the Iran war threatens to push inflation higher, not lower. Every $10 increase in oil prices adds 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points to consumer inflation over the following year. Oil has already risen roughly $10 year to date. Further increases would add to the inflation the Fed is already struggling to control. Tariffs continue adding to price pressures. The Trump administration's trade policy has raised costs on imported goods. Those cost increases get passed to consumers. The transitory impact that some Fed officials hoped for has proven more persistent. Services inflation remains sticky because it depends on labor costs. Wage growth continues running around 4%. That wage growth gets reflected in the prices of services that are labor-intensive. Haircuts, restaurant meals, healthcare, education, all of it costs more because the people providing those services earn more. The inflation picture does not justify rate cuts. It barely justifies holding steady. If anything, the inflation picture justifies the rate hikes that some Fed officials wanted to signal. The hawks have the data on their side. Inflation is above target and not falling fast enough. Oil shocks threaten to push it higher. Tariffs continue adding pressure. The argument for cutting rates into that environment is weak. This is why quite some time means what it says. The conditions for rate cuts do not exist. The conditions for rate hikes might emerge, and the conditions for holding steady are clearly present, so rates stay where they are for quite some time. Now let me bring all of this together because you need to understand what this environment means for your financial planning. The Fed is stuck. Hawks want to signal rate hikes. Doves want 4 rate cuts. The middle wants to hold steady for quite some time. The committee cannot agree on direction. The The default when agreement is impossible is to do nothing, so nothing happens. Rates stay at 3.5 to 3.75%. The probability of a March cut is 3%. The probability of an April cut is about 23%. The probability of a June cut is about 44%. Even by summer, the market sees less than a coin flip chance of any rate relief. And those probabilities could fall further if the oil shock from Iran materializes as persistent inflation. The Fed chair transition adds uncertainty. Warsh may or may not be confirmed in time. His policy approach may or may not deliver the rate cuts Trump demanded. Senator Tillis may or may not follow through on his threat. Powell may or may not stay as a governor after his chairmanship ends. Every dimension of leadership is uncertain. The Iran war adds uncertainty. Oil prices may spike further or stabilize. The supply disruption may be temporary or prolonged. The inflation impact may be transitory or persistent. Hammock says it is too early to gauge. The Fed is waiting to assess. And while they wait, rates stay elevated. In this environment, you cannot plan around rate cuts. You cannot assume relief is coming. You cannot wait for lower mortgage rates to buy a house. You cannot count on lower credit card rates to pay down debt. The relief may come eventually, but quite some time could be many months. And those months of elevated costs compound into real money lost. I am not a financial advisor, and nothing I say should be taken as financial advice, but what I can tell you is that Beth Hammock just told you rates stay elevated for quite some time. The CME FedWatch tool shows 97% probability of no March cut. The Fed is split into factions that cannot agree on direction. The Iran war adds uncertainty that the Fed cannot yet gauge. The chair transition adds drama that threatens leadership continuity. And every month this situation persists is a month you pay elevated borrowing costs on your mortgage, your credit card, your car loan, your business financing. Quite some time. Those are the words from a voting Fed official. Quite some time is not March, it is not April, it is probably not June. It might be the entire year of 2026 if inflation stays elevated and the war keeps oil prices high. The rate cuts that were supposed to provide relief are not coming on schedule. They may not be coming at all. And the planning you did based on assuming rate relief needs to be revised to account for a reality where relief does not arrive. Subscribe to Market Acme right now and join our WhatsApp community for real-time updates because the Fed's March meeting is 2 weeks away and every statement from every official between now and then will move markets, the split inside the committee, the confirmation drama around Warsh, the war's impact on inflation. All of it affects whether quite some time becomes even longer or whether conditions finally shift toward the rate relief you have been waiting for. I am Kenzo John. I am not a financial advisor. This is Market Acme, and I will keep showing you what Fed officials are actually saying, what the probability data actually shows, and what the gap between the rate cuts you expected and the quite some time reality means for your financial life. 97% probability of no March cut, quite some time of elevated rates ahead. A Fed split between hawks who want hikes and doves who want aggressive cuts. A chair transition threatened by an investigation into building renovations. And a war that adds uncertainty the Fed cannot yet gauge. This is the environment in which your borrowing costs are being set. This is the reality that determines what you pay for your mortgage, your credit card, your car loan. And this reality says quite some time of elevated rates before anything changes. Join our WhatsApp community for updates because every Fed statement matters, every probability shift matters, and understanding what quite some time actually means for your wallet is the difference between planning intelligently and being caught by surprise when the relief you expected never arrives. Quite some time. Remember those words. They are the answer to when rates come down, and the answer is not soon.